This is a major topic of debate in Scotland without, I don't think, many sensible outcomes at the moment. And I want, in this short talk, to talk about some of the issues as I see them, very much a personal view, to note some of the progress that has occurred over recent decades, and to come out with my own very personal 5-point plan. Now then. It's frozen. Has it start video? Does it mean? No. Sorry. When I talk about the issues, it's very easy to think about particular types of land uses, but I want you to think about them in a slightly different way this evening. Issues about the instability of the ground surface as a result of land uses, the inequity of the way that policies operate, the way that land is owned and used, the uncertainty as a result of a whole range of external, exogenous issues over which we don't have much control at the moment, and what I like to call an incoherence of policy. There's a lot of instability in the ground surface. I think some of it is a result of natural factors. I'm a geomorphologist by training, and I would think that anyway, as is displayed here on the left there, part of the great Trottenish escarpment in Skye, or here a flash flood in the upper reaches of Glentana and Deeside. There's inevitably much more natural instability as a result of the effects of increasing intensity of precipitation, high precipitation energy events, and slopes just collapse. They cannot withhold themselves any longer. And you'll see in the bottom right a marketing slogan for a wonderful book produced by Colin Ballantyne of St Andrews University on Scotland's mountain landscapes, which gives a very broad perspective on all of this. But of course, most of the instability that we see, I think, is inevitably human-induced. I think most of CIEEM members and many of you from the general public who are listening this evening will be familiar with issues of overgrazing by sheep, although I would observe that this is less of a problem now than it was, say, 20 years ago, ever since the McSharry reforms of the Common Agricultural Policy, which resulted in the reduction in the number of the headage payments for sheep. That has not been a problem. But I think the major problem of overgrazing is due to red deer. And the map on the right gives you some idea of deer densities around Scotland. You'll see very high densities scattered right around the eastern Grampians, Loch Arbour, Monaleath, and into the Northern Highlands. So it's not a very localized problem, it's a very widespread problem. And to be perfectly honest, successive organizations and now poor old Nature Scott, my old organization, I managed to resist being merged with the Deer Commission when I was chief exec, and I do feel sorry for them being landed with this major land use problem, which seems to be quite intractable at the moment, because we've got 400,000 or so red deer, and although the cull numbers are increasing, the numbers in total are not going down. There's a lot of instability ground disturbance through tree planting. This is probably the worst example I've seen. If the Confederation of Forestry were listening, and I hope they are, they would say, well, of course, this is past practice. Rubbish. This is 2 years ago. This is a Forest Scotland grant-aided scheme, perfectly vegetated slope, deep ploughing down the slope, absolutely scandalous, and they still got public money for it. And at the other end of the afforestation business, we have the instability with the removal of trees, huge industrial machinery on very fragile soils. I'm no expert on carbon loss, but it's quite clear from what the experts say that there's a great deal of carbon loss, both in the planting stage and in the commercial harvesting stages, and tremendous loss of soils, of nutrients, and a massive amount of instability. And something needs to be done about it. Similarly, with the development of wind turbines and associated upgrading of our national grid, the power lines, we have instability in the ground as well. The little photograph on the left is just one of the pylons in the Bewley-Denny extension through Drumocta Pass. A lot of ground disturbance, and the map that you see on the screen there, the point there is look at the extent of the roads. Those black lines on the map, as well as the turbine towers. All of those are disturbing the ground surface. Sadly, too many of these wind farms are on carbon-rich soils, podsoils, peaty podsoils, peats themselves. And there doesn't seem to be any control over this whatsoever, because we are told that planting of non-native commercial species is, of course, great for sequestering carbon, which seems to be not the case from the scientists who are saying actually it's much better planting deciduous trees. Microhydro development is another way of trying to use renewable energy sources, but even in the best laid schemes like this one at Invermark in the Angus Glens, there's a lot of ground disturbance to get it moving. That sediment clogs up the rivers, the spawning beds for the fish, for instance. So there's lots of natural and then human-induced instability in our land surface, and that makes it look uglier, it makes it look industrialized, and of course it is not very good environmental practice. The second issue I want to raise is what I call the inequity of land ownership. Now, this is not a tirade against large estate owners or anything, it's just that it's a lottery how land is allocated. Public bodies, apart from, I think they're called Forest and Land Scotland, are now very little in the land owning field. But obviously there's a growth through the Scottish Land Fund of community land ownership, which is apparently politically a good thing, socially equitable, but often these people do not have the capacity to manage the swathes of land they're taking on, and are using a great deal of public money to keep going. And of course, there is then the acquisition of land by private individuals. There are no controls on that. That's just a comment. It's not a criticism. But some countries do have controls on that, but we don't. I would say there was an inequity in the way certain large areas of land are used for sporting. You still see lots of new tracks going up the hills. I see them all the time, for instance, in the Borders region. This is in the Monolith Mountains from some years back. There don't seem to be any controls, despite repeated efforts by NGOs, Scottish Link, for instance, as well as SNH, to try and get a handle on this. And I think also there are lots of examples of ineffective muir burn. Surely we shouldn't be allowing muir burn at all. We have to think of a totally new paradigm, because all muir burn is doing, after all, is putting more carbon into the atmosphere. And there's an inequity of management objectives. It entirely depends on, if you like, the whim and fancy of the owner. On the left there, you have more sporting estate management. On the right, renaturalizing, or what some people inaccurately, I think, call rewilding. And so we have to ask the question, which is, I think, an equity question, of whose values is all this about? I deliberately put this photograph in, which was taken from the top of Ben Lawes, which is, of course, owned in perpetuity by a charity, the National Trust for Scotland, and looking towards the Ben itself, Ben Nevis, which, of course, is also owned, hopefully in perpetuity, by the John Muir Trust. And it does raise this question, uh, who is it? What are the various communities of interest? And how can we get a better balance from those of us like myself who live in urban areas but want to go to climb the hills, to look at the scenery, to value nature? It won't surprise you to hear me saying there's great uncertainty, of course. We don't know what the Brexit outcome is going to be. The Treasury would like to stop the cap funds being used for anything. What we have in terms of markets, what trade deal we have with the EU, and we're still waiting, despite best promises, for nature protection legislation to roll forward the Natura 2000 scheme. We've got the climate and biodiversity crises, but what does that mean in terms of the use of the land in the uplands of Scotland? And whilst there are lots of interesting ideas on the green agenda for post-COVID-19, we're not really sure about that. And I think, finally, there's a lot of incoherence. We're not really sure who's in control. Is it the government? Is it the owners? Is it the communities? There's a lot of top-down decision systems, and there's real splits in the way that government money is used because it's in different parcels and it's still operated in a silo mentality. Oh my God, you might say, I'm not going to listen to this guy anymore. He's all doom and gloom. Well, there's a lot of good practice happening. I'm only going to choose a few examples here. If you come to our conference on the 27th, you'll hear some excellent examples. One of them is, I think, making the land more natural. This is an example down in the borders off Moffat Dale, the Crofts Wildwood by the Borders Woodland Trust. Look at the contrast over 16 years. And I drove past it the other day and it looks even better now 5 years on. Forest and Land Scotland, as they're now called, have done a good job in some place in removing non-native species like the Sitka spruce at the Blackwood of Rannoch National Nature Reserve to make sure that those native species are protected. There is a massive program for peatland restoration, blocking drains, covering over the holes at high levels. It's very delicate work, and it's really good to see this happening at a financial input which exceeds most of many people's expectations. And albeit at a smaller level, but I think very important, is the footpath repair program that started many decades ago has been successful in places. We have to keep going at it. I'll just show you one example here on the National Trust land. Ben Lomond looking south, you can see the loch in the background on both the photos, which are taken from pretty much the same point, and see how the erosion has been controlled by proper footpath development and management. And of course, as far as Scottish Government's concerned, when the role of the Parliament improving new legislation, we have national parks, we have the access legislation, we have groundbreaking climate change legislation, we've had a lot of new nature legislation, we've got, and I'll come back to this one later, a revolutionary Scottish land rights and responsibility statement, and we have a statutory requirement for a land use strategy. All very laudable. But when I was preparing this talk, I thought, well, I'd better go back to a report I was party to in 2008, a committee of inquiry into the future of Scotland's hills and islands produced by the Royal Society of Edinburgh with Gavin McCrone, the economist, as the chair, Jeff Maxwell, who formerly led the Macaulay Institute as vice chair, and myself as the secretary. And this is what we came up with. And I won't read it all out, but I want to just flag up fragmentation, administrative focus rather than consumer focus, still arguments between public sector organizations. Do you recognize that? I'm sure you, as CIEEM members in the consultancy world do, and top-down approaches. So let's think of it a different way. What's my answer? It's a bit pie in the sky, and it's deliberately so. It's meant to be so because in this world, everybody's talking about not sameness, nothing's going to be the same again. I heard the phrase business unusual first used way back in 2008 by the then finance minister of the Republic of South Africa in an international meeting we were attending. But too often I see business as usual continuing because people have got their blinkers on. So my action for a better future is a business unusual vision, an ethical basis for everything, appropriate national frameworks, reinvigorating local action, and developing and applying new approaches. Let's have a look at each of these in turn. We demand many different things from our land. It doesn't matter where we are in Scotland, but thinking of the uplands,
I've lost picture and the sound. I just don't know how to do it.
Sorry, I can hear somebody speaking. So what I think we need to do is determine multiple objectives for the land that recognizes it's about looking after nature, which I call environmental justice. I think that's extremely important. It has to be climate positive. In other words, the activities that I was flagging up earlier, which are releasing carbon, destroying soil structures, removing vegetation, none of that's climate positive at all. So we need to turn that round. It needs to be what I call a holistic view of all of nature, because this is not just about biodiversity. This is the geographer geomorphologist coming back. It's about the bio and the geo locking together. What we call the biodiversity is an actor on nature's stage, which is the soils and the moisture and the water and nutrient system, seeing that as a whole. And that leads on to the next point, which is really making sure that our whole ecosystems are really functioning properly. We spent so long disturbing them, removing the functionality. If we do those four things, that will be fundamental to addressing, I think, the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis and the bad land stewardship crisis, as I would call it. But we need to go beyond that. We need to look at the whole of the landscape, what I would call the harmony of the landscape and this sense of place that we're now talking about. We need to think as stewards for the future. In other words, intergenerational social equity. We need to force businesses in whatever their role, whether they're energy companies, whether they're multinational companies, whether they're big retail outfits that own land, to think of the economic triple bottom line. And we also need to think about how we can build further our capacity to manage this very varied and very multi-objective situation. The second point I raise is what I call an ethical basis for everything. I suppose it must be to do with my age. The more I think about nature, it's not just about getting the science right and the management on the ground right. It's actually about something at a higher level, the ethical basis. I don't know whether any of you have read the Earth Charter with its 16 principles, as it says on there on the screen, powering a global movement towards a more just, sustainable and peaceful world. There's the link on the screen there. Excuse me. I deliberately put up the picture there, which many of you will recognize. It's the Glen of ecological transformation, otherwise known as Glen Feshie, devastated for years by poor management, overgrazing by deer, lack of management of the native species, particularly the two types of juniper and the native pines. It's taken the latest of the three Danish owners, Anders Poulsen and his wife, through Wildland Limited to transform this. And I would commend looking at their website, because the ethical basis of their ownership is absolutely outstanding. If any of us, you know, deep greenies would have written it, we probably couldn't have written it as well as they have done. And it's this ethical basis that's enshrined in the Earth Charter. It's enshrined in other charters, the DNA Declaration, for instance, on the Earth. It's also in part enshrined in the Convention on Biological Diversity. Remember, go back to those principles. We've got to build that into our system and our thinking and get away from these narrow, it's my approach for my best interest. But we've made a wonderful start in Scotland. Although it had a fairly dodgy beginning, what's now the Scottish Land Rights and Responsibility Statement, many of you will remember, it was the government saying it was its objectives. And I mean, many of us said, what a ridiculous notion. It's not your objectives, it is the objectives of everybody. And we now have the 5 principles enshrined in there. And there's some excellent work being done by the Scottish Land Commission on teasing those out and developing the codes of practice. This is vital. There's no point in having the statement if nobody takes any notice of it. I want to take it a lot further than perhaps the government would. I want to apply it in practice. And I've got 5 ideas there that I would like to see. Firstly, isn't this blindingly obvious? No public money unless you operate the principles. It's what many people have been called public money for public goods. That we develop contracts with owners of land for delivery over longer term, so that we're moving away from short-term government financial cycles of 4 or 5 years into 25 years. It's been done before. We did it in Scottish Natural Heritage, I remember. We need to make sure that there is a body, and I'll come back to this in a moment, to enforce the responsibilities. Because too often we say, here are the conditions, and then, of course, nobody comes and looks over the dike, for instance, or goes onto the hill to look what's really happening. And I think the 4th point is we've got a wonderful opportunity to redistribute the roughly £500 million of common agriculture policy money. And Scotland can do that. It doesn't have to keep saying the Treasury won't let us. It's in its command to reward good stewardship. And we should back that up with an even better on-the-ground land advisory service. The Scottish Rural University College, the old SAC, their advisors do a splendid job, but I think we need a lot more of that. That brings me to the government. I can't let them off the hook. They've got to contribute to this. I worry that they want to have a control on everything. I'm not going to dwell further on that comment. Maybe we see it every other day. I think we need to have a mindset change in the cabinet secretaries and their ministers and their political advisors, and obviously in their civil servants, to facilitate local initiatives. And that's why I think, second there, that we should see a statutory basis for regional land use partnerships, a point I'll return to because that's my 4th point. The government should be providing financial incentives to implement the rights and responsibilities. This is a positive action, paying for doing things which are good for the public, good for nature and the environment. It's not about paying compensation and the traditional old-fashioned approaches, or the old-fashioned approach of which we still have with the common agriculture policy of the single farm payment, which is paying people because they own a certain amount of land. Out of date. And coupled with that, we should be thinking about valuing the land in a totally different way, the natural capital basis. If you look at the work that the Natural Capital Initiative, chaired by that wonderful Oxford environmental economist Dieter Helm, is doing, that provides the basis. We shouldn't be valuing land by how many stags and how many grouse and how many salmon you catch, because that has a much greater public good value than that. And of course, the government needs to refresh its policy on key assets. It should be clear from what I've commented already, we are not protecting carbon-rich soils anything like enough. We know exactly where they are. We've known for decades. We're not protecting the scenery. National scenic areas are a fag end of protection. And fortunately, the Scottish Landscape Alliance has just come out very strongly in favour of internationally robust legislation. And we need to have the government making sure that the gains that we've had through being members of the EU for nature are enshrined in statute. But then you look at what I call the tale of two reports, the grouse report and the deer report. I could never understand why we had two separate reports looking at different aspects on the same piece of ground, so to speak. The grouse report, evidence clearly presented, comprehensive review of different mechanisms. Superb read, first class. And I know many of the people who contributed to that, and I'm not at all surprised. But the sector interests are unwilling to compromise, so that they kicked the outcome into the long grass 5 years down the road, as if there was not a problem, despite all the scientific evidence about raptor persecution that we now have. The deer report, sadly, it lacked the wonderful leadership of Simon Pepper, who died in the early stages of the report. So we have a very legalistic approach, not clear where the science is and the basis for deer density proposals. And to my mind, inconsequential legislative changes are proposed. The government needs, in its election manifesto for next year, and I hope that at least the Green Party, the Lib Dems and Labour, I can't see the Tories agreeing to this, but you never know, legislate on deer management and sporting estate licensing. It needs to be done to link up with all of the other initiatives, maybe even facilitate an uplands policy dialogue. Certainly, I think that's something we should be talking about in the CIEEM Scottish Policy Group. The Scotland's Landscape Alliance has just published its reports. I commend them to you. Excellent position statements, two there, and there are ones on other aspects of landscape. The fourth point will be of no surprise to those who've heard me speak on land use issues before. It is the importance of not regarding Scotland as all the same. The diversity is so great. So we need to invigorate or reinvigorate local action. And that's why I think we should have a statutory basis for regional land use partnerships. There's been pilot studies, there's been positive noises by the government, but nothing's really happening. I would like to have a much more dramatic change, helped with guidance from the Scottish Land Commission to develop and implement local land use strategies, that these bodies, these partnerships would be enabled to distribute government finance to projects. My God, I can see people in Pentland House quaking in their boots and saying Crofts has gone mad at this stage. I don't care what they think. I think this is what they should be thinking about. I think these partnerships should be able to determine decisions on land use, apart from them being, rather than being left to a government agency. We've just had this experience in the Glen Kens of Galloway, where a landowner put in an application for Sitka spruce on a hillside. They changed the whole aspect for a village. We protested, objected, and lo and behold, they approved it. But it was only due to local lobbying we changed it. And if you'd have had the partnership locally, it could have worked through those things, and they should be able to enforce the rights and responsibilities. We've got a good start for these. We've got the well-established Galloway and Southern Ayrshire biosphere. We've got the recently established Wester Ross. We've got the 2 national park authorities who are used to dealing with these issues, and bodies like the Tweed Forum. So we should be getting on with it. But we've got to change our thinking. We can't allow particular groups to protect their interest. And I was involved a few years ago with an Australian behavioral psychologist and an American environmental lawyer. And we published a paper saying a new paradigm for land stewardship. And I think this is relevant to this argument about how regional land use partnerships, when they're set up, should be operating. That you recognize the different behaviors of the constituencies, the communities of interest, that you use an inclusive approach to try and develop solutions. You develop an ethical charter. So we're back to the ethics again for the resource use and management. Different approaches to induce positive attitude changes. Make sure you develop policy that's locally relevant, as well as matching the high level Scotland-wide imperatives. We don't have that sufficiently at the moment. Obviously, it needs to have multiple objectives to your policy, and you exchange knowledge on an equal basis. Well, that's my holy grail. And finally, it must be blindingly obvious, but I think it's extremely important to those of you who are fellow members of the Chartered Institute that there are lots of help, decision support tools around the world. CIEEM, as a member of IUCN, will have good access to those, like the recently launched Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions. And in fact, CIEEM has produced its own version of that, which is first class. More recently, guidelines for conserving connectivity through ecological networks and corridors, very relevant for the uplands and the sort of thing that the Cairngorms Connect project is doing. And of course, the blockbuster of all, which was demanding transformational change, produced by the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. And of course, we're not bereft of tools here in Scotland. I'm going without any bias to point up the work that the James Hutton Institute is doing. Scenario frameworks with land use storylines, for instance, a whole range of decision support tools to enable modeling for the future, looking at it from different aspects. So that's my simple 5-point plan for you to gestate on over a glass of wine when you've finished listening. My headline is More Effective Policy and Action for All of Nature and All People. Thank you very much for listening.